Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Okay. Open for questions if anyone has any, or concerns with the material, problems with access. I wanted to start today with this article that I sent you some information on about consciousness, and it ties in, of course, with what we discussed last week. And what's particularly interesting, we're going to be talking about the Lotus Sutra, which involves the wisdom embracing all species. And so here we have the avian species that is credited with awareness. And it also gives us a sense of what is the meaning of consciousness, or as they put it here, sensory consciousness, in a scientific context today. So this is a professional article in the journal Science, Neural Correlate of Sensory Consciousness in a Corvid Bird, which is a crow. I thought you might want to take a look at them. So subjective experiences that can be consciously accessed and reported. This is what is being associated with the notion of consciousness. And usually it is tracked to the cerebral cortex in the human being. But what they found is there's a possibility that there are other ways for consciousness to arise than having the same kind of brain that we have. So whether sensory consciousness can also arise from differently organized brains that, like a layered cerebral cortex, such as a bird brain, remains unknown. So the study that they did on crows, they found a single neuron response in the pallial end brain of crows performing a visual detection task correlate with the bird's perception about stimulus presence or absence. So they saw this as an empirical marker of avian consciousness. So consciousness in the sense of consciousness of self, self-consciousness. So there's a lot of discussion about, does consciousness exist in other species? And I think it's helpful to talk about it as self-consciousness, consciousness of the self as a self, even though the self in a Buddhist context is considered to be a delusion. We're not sure if it's true for dogs, for example, but there has been quite a bit of interest in crows. They appear to be extremely intelligent. So it also talks about a two-stage process in which the first activity component mainly reflects physical stimulus intensity. This seems to be the second skandha of sensation, whereas the later component predicts the crow's perceptual reports. So that seems to be parallel with the third skandha, which is perception. So these results suggest that the neural foundations that allow sensory consciousness arose either before the emergence of mammals or independently. So it's not just something that one could expect in mammals, but other species as well. Any comment about this? I don't think it would be problematic in Buddhism because we're talking about, as we said, wisdom embracing all species, and the problem of dukkha and tanha is not found only within human beings. So it is also an issue of other sentient beings. Any comments on this? We had some interesting discussion in the commentary from last week about consciousness. Many people, or most people, seem to find the arguments of the Buddha in that particular context to be very convincing.
So maybe this suggests that there is no individual consciousness, and again, that we're just dipping into some field of consciousness while we're here.
Yes, well, since you mentioned the field of consciousness, I did want, I'm going to stop the share for just a moment here. I want to show you this book, which is a book on consciousness. Now, this is what they call in this context, they call it the doctrine of mere consciousness. It is also sometimes called all consciousness, or consciousness as more of a cosmic sense. But this is hundreds of years after the time of the Buddha. So it's almost 1,000 pages. It is bilingual, Chinese and English, but it's based on a Sanskrit text, which would put it in Mahayana Buddhism, and then gets taken over to China by the translator and becomes part of Chinese Buddhism. So there's a lot of discussion of that kind of consciousness, but we're taking it in an historical context. So we're looking only right now at what the Buddha has said, and we're moving on to what we're going to find in Mahayana, where there's going to be this expansion of the philosophical discussion. So let's get back to this one. Oops, gotta go back to the slideshow. Okay, there we are. So any other questions about this? Oh, it looks like we got a chat. Oh, yes, it's a question about resubmitting haiku essays for full credit. Absolutely, yes. And the resubmissions are not due until the 15th week of class, so the last day in which we meet for class. That's why I give you feedback on them. So if you want to go back and reflect on it, particularly towards the end of the semester, it helps you to prepare for the final exam. Okay, so we're moving from the suttas, which would be the Pali texts associated with Theravadan Buddhism, to the sutras, which are the Mahayana texts, comes from the same word, which means string, stringing together the pages of the original text. And so these are written in Sanskrit, and we're going to be looking at one chapter of the Lotus Sutra, which is 28 chapters, but the one that's most philosophically significant, I think, is number 2 that we'll look at. The entire text of the Heart Sutra, which can be printed on a single page of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, and the Diamond Sutra. So the Heart and the Diamond Sutra are both in the Kanza text. And I posted a link where you can find them online in a PDF form, or I think you can read it online. Okay, so if you're having any trouble with that, let me know. And I sent out the second chapter of the Lotus Sutra. It's also posted as a module on Canvas. So based on some of the comments that I've been seeing, the commentaries, I think we have a fairly sophisticated group of students in this class, so I'm going to be dipping into some of the deeper philosophical aspects that I usually reserve for later in class, but I think it's quite relevant to where we're going in Mahayana Buddhism. So there are 2 terms that are used that are often confused. One is Dharma, which in a Buddhist context refers to the teaching of the Buddha, the message of the Buddha. But there's also reference to dharmas in the plural. Now, I prefer to make the dharma, the singular, capitalized because it helps to make the distinction, and the plural dharmas, lowercase, but not all translators do that. Sometimes they have them both capitalized or both lowercase. But there is a distinction between them, but also a very important connection between them that will help us, I think, to understand better this increasingly sophisticated philosophical presentation. So we've already talked about the twofold truth. So there's the complete truth, and then there's the partial truth. So that's one way to look at Dharma, singular, and dharmas, plural. The Dharma, the teaching of the Buddha, is the complete truth. This represents what he realized, what his insights were. And we saw him talking about that, the knowledge that had arisen in him that had never been heard before, for example, in the first sutta. So one of the most important things that he realized is the state of impermanence, that reality is filled with impermanence. And that impermanence is regarded as unsatisfactory. We saw that in the second sutta, as it was related to the 5 skandhas. Each of them is unsatisfactory, and therefore none of them qualifies as the Atman. So impermanence is unsatisfactory to us, and thus life is experienced as dukkha. That's, of course, the first of the Fourfold Noble Truths. And I've underlined the experience part for an important reason here. Now, the dharmas are the framework through which we experience reality. So these are perceptions. We've talked from the very beginning about the problem of perceptions, the building blocks of delusion. So included among the dharmas are the 3 poisons: greed, hatred, and ignorance. So we experience reality through greed sometimes, through hatred sometimes, and through ignorance sometimes. And when we do that, we fuel tanha. And tanha is the cause of dukkha. So what the Buddha realized is this connection between how we experience reality and what are the causes that give rise to those experiences. So that's why we're talking about both what he realized, but the dharmas are how we basically live our lives. We live assuming those experiences are real, when in fact they are distorted and diluted. So that was his big breakthrough here. So what we also see here is a shift from metaphysics to epistemology in Buddhism. So the term Dharma did not originate in Buddhism. It's actually a term that was used in the Vedic religion. And they look at it as the law of the universe, the law of nature. It's the way things are. So it is a metaphysical kind of statement. But as we've seen, Buddhism is actually concerned about epistemology. So the Dharma now becomes the Buddha's message, and these dharmas, which had previously been looked at as the laws of nature, so that's actually the way things work, now the Buddha is saying, well, no, actually, that's not the way it is. So I've realized the problem with the dharmas. So yes, we've been assuming these to be reality, this framework of reality, when in fact, that is a mistake. And that's his message. The message is what we thought was real actually is not. It is a series of constructs. And that's why the mind is very important. So metaphysics, although there is a development of metaphysics in Buddhist philosophy through the hundreds of years it existed, that's not what the Buddha was really interested in. You don't need metaphysics if you have a poison arrow in your back. You need epistemology, that is, you need a knowledge so that you can do something about that poison arrow. And so he's always very pragmatically looking for what is it that we can know that can help us to avoid dukkha and all these delusions. Any questions about this? So you're going to see, particularly in the sutras, these terms used. So they become very important when we get to the Diamond Sutra in particular. Any questions, clarifications here? Okay, what prompted me to bring this up and try to understand that relationship, and this actually comes from the Diamond Sutra, this is the Buddha talking. All right, this is where it gets philosophically complex. The Dharma, that is the realization of the Buddha, at the root of dharmas is no dharma. So the teaching of the Buddha, the realization of the Buddha is not just a mere perception. It's different. It is the complete truth, whereas the dharmas, plural, are the partial truth. So I think that might not be too difficult to understand. So there is a distinction between them. The Dharma tells us the entire process of reality, whereas the framework from which we've been experiencing reality is not reality. So we've been mistaken in terms of what we take to be reality. But now it gets more complicated. The Dharma of no Dharma is still a Dharma. So even the teaching of the Buddha can be turned into just a perception. So here where I teach no Dharma, where he's trying to avoid this framework and get to the reality, he's not really trying to give us any information. How could the Dharma of Dharmas be a Dharma? So there's an underlying problem here. So what he's trying to convey to us is not just a series of mental constructs. It's not just a cognitive set. It's not just a way to view reality. He's talking about the experience of reality. That's what his Dharma, his teaching, is all about. But of course, you can't give somebody the experience. So when we're talking about the experience of reality, then there's a certain point at which it becomes another kind of view, becomes another kind of way of thinking, another kind of framework. So he's constantly trying to alert them to the fact that don't turn this into just another way of thinking, another viewpoint. You have to work hard to stick with the view of no view. So where he's trying to avoid teaching the framework, how could the Dharma of Dharmas be a Dharma? So where is the mistake come in? And that is if we are not constantly vigilant to be aware that the language, the words, that's not enough. It's all about the underlying experience. And that ties in with the first haiku essay, which is the question about the Buddha as a scientist. So the scientist is trying to have direct experience of reality. As soon as we try to put that into a philosophy, into a system of thought, then we're at risk of turning it into just another kind of viewpoint. So here is another way of trying to decode it. So the Dharma, at the root of Dharma is no Dharma. The teaching of Dharma underlies all things. So that's the full truth. All things that we experience without being reduced to just another view, cognitive set, or perception. So there is a distinction between the two. But the Dharma of no Dharma is still a Dharma. So even the Dharma teaching can function as a mere perception of you based on constructs of thought and language. Because thought and language cannot give you the experience. They kind of walk around the experience. So he says, here where I teach no Dharma, a so-called sacred place, where no Dharma or view is taught, so the view of no view, where cognitive sets of constructs are deconstructed, where we're completely aware of how we are deluded by these thought constructs. How could the Dharma of Dharmas be a Dharma? So there's the risk of turning the teaching into just another viewpoint. But if you do it right, if you're, again, maintaining that deep awareness, then you can avoid that kind of problem. So the Dharma teaching about the emptiness of Dharmas as constructs gets beneath the thought and language. So as we get into the Mahayana Sutras, we're going to talk more about this emptiness of Dharmas. The Dharmas are empty in the sense that they don't have any independent existence. They're not separate entities. And so the imagery we have here, first we're going to take a look at Inada, our good friend Inada, talking about the non-dualism of Dharma and Dharmas. So there's a connection, but there's also this important distinction. So as he puts it, early Buddhists analyzed human experience as constituted of many aspects and characteristics and labeled them not without a profound meaning as dharmas. So how we experience reality. These are the frameworks for our experience. So all these so-called psychosomatic dharmas delineate a very elaborate framework in which experience takes place. So this is how we make sense of our experience. In order to make sense of our experience, we have to think about it. We have to communicate. We talk about it. So once we introduce thought and language, we're at risk of turning it into a view. So one of the key concepts that enters here is the emptiness or shunyata of the dharmas. So with the conversion of the samsaric dharmas into purity, the experience is at once transformed into nirvanic dharma, the capture of the Buddhist truth of existence. So that's what the Buddha is trying to do with his teaching. He's trying to capture the truth of existence in his teaching. So which signifies the keen insight of using the same word applicable to the same realm of existence in terms of its initial impurity and its later purity. So it's kind of like being fooled by the magic trick and understanding what the trick is. So we do create these intellectual frameworks to try to understand what we experience in the world. But at the same time, we have to realize that that framework is not the experience. So one of the images that I thought might be helpful here, so this is not something Inada did, if we look at light, you pass the light through the prism, and then we see all these different colors. So when Dharma is pure or complete, a little uncomfortable with the notion of pure, so let's just say it's complete, this is what he calls nirvanic Dharma. This is the complete truth. But when you pass it through this neural processing, if you'd like to call it that, then it becomes impure or fragmentary. So then we have samsaric dharmas, but they're actually empty. So what does this mean? Well, on this side, we see different colors. We see pink, we see blue, we see different shades of green and yellow, but they're not independently existing. That's what the Buddhist means by saying they're empty. They're not separate entities. They're actually pieces of the one Dharma. So these are the samsaric dharmas, and this is the complete Dharma. So if we fixate on any one of those as being single and separate, then we're mistaking the way reality works. They're actually all interconnected. So emptiness does not mean they're not being experienced, but they're not single and separate. And that's why we also talk about Atman as empty. It's not that we don't have a sense of ourself as a self. It's not that we do not have self-consciousness, but what is meant by self-consciousness is not that we are independent from each other, but we are actually connected. Everything connects to everything else. That praticca samutpada. Does everybody get at least a taste of what's going on here? So it always puzzled me why we would use the same word dharma in what seemed to be two very different ways. And then I just recently came across this essay by Inada where he discusses it. And he says, it's not accidental at all. This was actually a part of the twofold truth being expressed. There is a connection, but it's just on this side with all the colors that we are misreading our experience. We have a diluted view of that experience. Does everyone get a sense of what's going on here?
That cleared things up for me, so thank you.
Oh, good.
Okay, good.
I didn't quite hear that. It's kind of muddled. So I've got one other illustration here, and that is birds again. There seems also to be something like a species-specific perception. So this is a recent article, hummingbirds navigate an ultraviolet world we never see. So there are certain dharmas that are not accessible to us. In this case, these are dharmas having to do with color. So nectar drinking birds use enhanced color vision to distinguish sources of food. So their perception of reality is accordingly different than our perception of reality. But even though there's a different perception, they have different dharmas, we could say, they're still part of dharma, the reality that the Buddha is talking about. Okay, so let's connect this up with the suttas so we can see the consistency between what's going on in the sutras in terms of what we saw in the suttas. So the first one, turning the wheel, certain claims and an argument being presented, starts out with these two extreme lifestyles that are unworthy and unprofitable. And those two lifestyles are what? What does the Buddha tell them to reject as a lifestyle?
Hedonism and asceticism?
That's right. That's right. So they had already rejected hedonism, but they were wallowing in asceticism. And he convinces them, based on the Fourfold Truth, that they are both unworthy and unprofitable. It has to do with dukkha, which is caused by tanha, and the cause and effect relationship, and the fact that you can eliminate both of them. And how do you do that? Through this epistemological transformation. You have to change how you think you know reality. So that's a kind of an encapsulated view of the basic philosophy in that sutta. And then last time we looked at the Anatta Sutta, and we got more of an interaction here between the Buddha and the five monks. And they come to a consensus on the five skandhas. That form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, they're all impermanent, which means they're all unsatisfactory, and therefore they are not Atman. And there doesn't seem to be any other place to look for that Atman, that sense of identity that they were obsessed about. So last time we also talked about that getting out of oneself. So I know there is a kind of an inherent wariness about letting go of self because it seems like it's a loss, that this is something that is our identity, and how can I let that go? And then we had that interesting quote from William James that you have to get out of oneself, stay out, and to stay out, you have some absorbing errand. And then I thought, after the class, of this real life case, which I've subsequently added to the Anatta Sutta PowerPoint, but I wanted to include it here so we could see why it's a good thing to get out of yourself and to stay out, and has to do with the uplifting emotions of getting out of oneself. So this is a program in South Carolina run by the Department of Corrections called Meow Mates, Mutt Mates, and Inmates. And what happens is they rescue animals and they take them to the prison where they're looked after by what are known as hardcore prisoners, prisoners who are unlikely to ever get out of prison because of the crimes they've committed. And it has had an extreme emotional impact on the people in the prison. So this was a group went into the prisons and interviewed them. And what they realized by working with these stray animals, they're not going to keep them. They're just socializing them so they can go on and get what they call their forever homes. These hardcore prisoners come to realizations. Working with these animals who have been cast aside by society, they realize that everyone deserves a second chance. So that's an exact quote from them. They talk about how the plight of these rescued animals melts ego. And ego is the kind of self that we're talking about here that you have to get out of. It also, again, from their own testimony, is the first time they ever thought of anyone but themselves. And that is an incredible change in the way they look at the world. And probably the most interesting or sympathetic prisoner, he was still a young man, but he had been in there since age 17, had no chance of parole, so he'd be spending the rest of his life there. And he said, well, if he has to do that, he doesn't have any choice, at least working with these animals makes it meaningful. So I think we definitely could see that these are people who have gotten out of themselves and have been able to stay out by finding an absorbing errand, something they can do with their lives. So forget yourself and become the universe. Hakuin. So this whole notion of identity continues to be problematic even for Buddhists. And so we see an expansion of the message of Buddhism as we get into the great vehicle of Mahayana. So again, these texts are written in Sanskrit. These sutta texts are written in Pali. So there's several hundred years that separates them from the time of the original Buddha. So now we begin to see much more discussion of what we might call our true identity. We're not bringing back the self. We're certainly not bringing back the Atman, but that doesn't mean we don't have some kind of identity. And that identity is now going to be discussed in terms of Buddha wisdom, specifically in the Lotus Sutra, but also something called wisdom gone beyond, which is another phrase for the word compassion, the kind of compassion that the inmates have for those rescued animals. So this is a kind of a condensation of the messages we're going to see in each of these sutras, starting with the lotus, then the heart, and then the diamond. So thinking of it in terms of the the three stages, the triple loop, we have to suspend, redirect, and then let go of this deluded view of these dharmas that are holding us back. So in the Lotus Sutra, the message from the Buddha is to stop the task-driven approach of Buddhist practice that is found in what is called the three vehicles, and then shift to a stimulus-driven form of attention in terms of the one Buddha vehicle. So there is an intentional way of discussing Buddhist practice to make it seem easier for people. And now the Buddha is saying, well, I think you're ready to move on to the real form of practice. And here we also get the notion of this wisdom, which is embracing all species. And at the very end of the chapter, we find the minds of the audience members dancing with joy. Remember, joy was also a component in the first sutta and the second sutta. The joy of the audience and also the joy that the Buddha takes in seeing that there's been an impact on his audience. And when we get to the Heart Sutra, we have the Bodhisattva of compassion who is speaking to the wisest disciple of the Buddha. So it's just the two of them. The Buddha does not appear in the Heart Sutra. So again, we're doing this triple loop. Stop this fixation on task-driven wisdom and shift to stimulus-driven compassion. So the role of wisdom and compassion as two wings of a bird. And that bird's not flying unless you get both wings. And the final message there is gone, gone, gone. And that's exactly the wording that is used. And when we get to the Heart Sutra, I think you'll begin to see what it is that's gone and why it's good that it's gone. So this is part of a collection of texts that are called the Prajna Paramita texts, which literally means Prajna wisdom that is gone beyond Paramita. And another text in that collection is the Diamond Sutra. So stop fixation on becoming a task-driven bodhisattva and shift your attention to a stimulus-driven notion of Buddhahood. So at the beginning of the Diamond Sutra, his disciple Subhuti wants to know how he should follow the bodhisattva path. And similar to what we saw in the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha actually directs him towards the Buddha path rather than just the bodhisattva path. That Subhuti is settling for less than he needs to settle for. And this is a much larger group, so we have a specific number of 1,250 monks and bodhisattvas that are in attendance. And it has a very interesting formula that is repeated throughout the Diamond Sutra. X is not X and therefore has been called X. For example, Dharma is not Dharma and therefore has been called Dharma. Bodhisattvas are not bodhisattvas and therefore have been called bodhisattvas. So it seems very contradictory, but in fact, it gets back to the problem, not of Buddhist philosophy, but the problem of language. It's the calling part that makes the problem. So when we put it into a linguistic formula, that's when the problem arises. So this is just a preview of what we're going to see. Any comments or questions here? I think you can already see there's a lot more going on than the few pages that we saw in the suttas. Bruce Lee, Artist of Life. I think he can help us out here. So why is it that we need to move from this task-driven cognitive set, this internal mentation, the self acting on the other? Well, as he tells us, the primary reality is not what I think. So what I think is encapsulated in that framework of the dharmas. There's more to reality than what I think. In fact, often what I think distorts reality. So that's why we have the distinction between the Dharma, the realization of the Buddha through his awakening, and the dharmas, which are the ways in which we try to interpret or make sense of our experiences. So instead of the thinking reality, he endorses the living reality. This would be the stimulus-driven interaction with the environment. So that is an expression of Pratityasamutpada, of our interconnectedness. And that again shows us why self is the problem. That when the self gets in the way, then we're not going to be able to have that interaction with the environment, with reality as a whole. So live, efficient movement is one thing. Sterile classical sets that bind are another. So those sterile classical sets that bind, those are the dharmas we've been talking about. These set ways of interpreting reality. They can be very helpful, but at a certain point, they become a hindrance. And then the last point brings in the issue of emptiness or shunyata. There is a subtle difference between having no form and having no form, the dash in between. So no form, no thingness, that's what shunyata is. It's not a negation of form, but it's just not a fixation on form. So the first is ignorance. The second is transcendence. And what Buddhism is moving towards is the transcendence. We have to transcend the dharmas, the way we think, because there's more to reality than what thought and language can encapsulate. So Bruce Lee had studied both Taoism and Buddhism. So if we start at the bottom here, we have this narrow, egocentric, task-driven form of attention. It's me, 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 and that's me, again, is a primary hindrance to getting in touch with reality. And as we'll see in the Lotus Sutra, there's also this sense of unworthiness. How can I possibly imagine that I can follow the Buddha path? That's one reason why the three vehicles, the three different paths are being practiced, because people don't think that they can actually become a Buddha. That's because of their very narrow, egocentric, task-driven attention. And what's happening is this opening up in the Lotus Sutra, opening up the minds of the audience members, who are all Buddhist practitioners, to be all that you can be. And in a Buddhist context, to be all you can be is to be a Buddha. So increasingly encompassing this allocentric, stimulus-driven interconnectedness. And when you are able to do that, then you have the reaction of a sense of flow and joy. So joy is going to come up quite often here. So in the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha is, as he describes it, opening the door to Buddha wisdom. And that is really opening the door to universal Buddhahood. And the response is joy. So people who are settling for a lesser form of practice, the voice hearer, the Pratikya Buddha, the Bodhisattva, and he says, don't even bother with those, go for it. Go for the Buddha vehicle, because that's the only one that's real. These are just ways of making yourself comfortable at a lesser degree of practice. And this whole notion of joy, a very interesting book, the Book of Joy, which includes interactions between the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, who's an archbishop from South Africa, become very good friends over the years. And what does the Dalai Lama say about joy? What is the connection between joy and Buddha? He says, as soon as I wake up, I remember Buddha's teaching, the importance of kindness and compassion, wishing something good for others, or at least to reduce their suffering. So the reducing of the suffering, that seems to be emphasized more, particularly in the early suttas, but going further than that, wishing good for others. Then I remember everything is interrelated, the teaching of interdependence. So his joy is directly related to his understanding of Buddhist philosophy. But that is the logical conclusion of manifesting kindness, compassion, interconnectedness. So our commentary this week is what differences do you discern between the three suttas we discussed and the Lotus Sutra chapter you just read? So what has changed in the style of presentation? How is the Buddha portrayed and treated in the two different kinds of literature? Is there a consistent message, or is there something new? So any questions about that? This is all our background information. This one's already been posted online, so it's available there. Okay, so let's go to the lotus. So imagery is always important. The Lotus Sutra is not named coincidentally. There's a meaning to the whole notion of the lotus. It is the flower that is most closely associated with Buddhism in terms of practice and also in terms of philosophy. And as we get to the end of the PowerPoint, we'll begin to see why that is the case. But one of the things that we could talk about is the beauty of the lotus. So the lotus is known for having its roots in the mud, and that's where it has to live in order for it to thrive, but it uplifts itself. And it is very beautiful and very aesthetically pleasing. Nonetheless, it has its roots in the mud, and that mud represents samsara. So this is another indication of non-dualism, samsara and nirvana. The beauty of the blossom is the nirvana, but it is rooted in samsara. Samsara is nirvana, nirvana is samsara. And the beauty of the Lotus Sutra text itself, which has been evaluated as one of the most aesthetically pleasing pieces of world literature, for me, the context of Sanskrit literature in particular, it is something that has to be attractive to the audience and not just a dry philosophical treatise. So the philosophy is there, but it's presented in a very unique kind of way. Anybody want to comment on their experience of reading this chapter? Did you notice anything interesting about it? Anything unexpected?
I was just confused as to why the Buddha was like treated so highly, I guess, kind of almost like a deity.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, and he's, that's why one of the questions in the commentary is, what is the way that people treat the Buddha? And it's different. So in the suttas, now he's just this guy that the five ascetics know, and then they began to realize, oh, he's got something, but it doesn't have that adulation that comes out. Yeah, so it's a whole nother form of presentation going on here. And I always have to explain when they talk to the Buddha, sometimes he's referred to as the Lord. They don't mean like the Lord on high. They're not meaning it in the sense of the Lord God, as people would think in Christianity, but somebody who is highly placed in society. So it's not an indicator of their divine status, and can easily be misinterpreted that way. Yeah. Any other comments on just the reading of the text itself? It's obviously much longer, even one chapter, than the suttas, longer than all of the three suttas if you put them together. I have to admit, the first time that I read the Lotus Sutra, I was asked to do the Lotus Sutra for my teaching at Fo Guangshan in Taiwan, and I hadn't read it, and I started reading it, and I thought, what am I doing with this stuff? What has this got to do with philosophy? Because it's got so much drama going on, and all this magical, mystical stuff going on. And it took me several years to really get to the philosophical heart of it, and the beauty of having both this aesthetic presentation and also a philosophical presentation, bringing philosophy to the kind of audience that normally would run away from philosophy. And it has had a very high reputation ever since. Many groups of Buddhists, different schools of Buddhism, actually rate it as the most important of all the sutras. So here, for example, Nikkyo no Wana, in a book called Buddhism for Today, which is all about the Lotus Sutra, says that it represents the supreme teachings of the Buddha, a profound teaching and a wonderful work of art. So it is both at the same time. Another example of non-dualism. And one of the comments that got me to rethink the Lotus Sutra is this one from Master Hakuin, the guy who said, forget yourself and become the universe. We're going to talk about him later in the semester. He says, outside the mind, there is no Lotus Sutra. And outside the Lotus Sutra, there is no mind. Well, he's a Zen master. They say strange things, right? So let's try to deconstruct that. Outside the mind, there is no Lotus Sutra. So what is he actually telling us? Where does the Lotus Sutra exist? I've got several different translations of the Lotus Sutra in my library, but none of them really is the Lotus Sutra according to Hakuin. The Lotus Sutra takes up residence in
our mind.
In our minds. That's right. So the Lotus Sutra is not a text. It is not a physical text. It's really all about our mind. But then outside the Lotus Sutra, there is no mind. So the mind only exists inside the Lotus Sutra. And the Lotus Sutra only exists inside the mind. So the equation of mind and Lotus Sutra, that the Lotus Sutra will show us how our mind works. That's quite a claim to make. I probably taught this sutra more than any of the other sutras over the years. And every time I teach it, there's always something more that I see. It is extremely complicated and can be read at many different levels. So if you like a lot of dramatic action, you got lots of things going on. I would make a really great series of chapters turned into, a TV series or something like that, or something that you could, watch online, because there's so much that is concrete in terms of how it describes the world that the Buddha is talking about and living in. But we're mainly interested in the philosophical part. So there are really three key teachings that are found in the Lotus Sutra. And in many ways, they are presented here for the first time in as open a way compared to other sutras, and certainly other suttas. So first, the claim that the Lotus Sutra is the ultimate message. This is what the Buddha was trying to say all along. So that's why some people think it is the most important of all the sutras. This is the distillation of what the Buddha wanted to tell us. So it answers the question, what is the one vehicle? There is only one way to become awakened. Even though previously they talk about, different choices you might have. Second is that Buddhahood is possible for everyone, the doctrine of universal Buddhahood. So then that becomes the question, who is the audience? Well, everyone is the audience. There's no one who is left out. That's why it is the wisdom embracing all species. Now this one, even though it sounds extremely positive, also was very contentious. Because even among Buddhists themselves, there was a lot of discussion, particularly in early Chinese Buddhism, about whether it was possible for all beings, even all human beings, to become Buddhas. And they had great debates about this. And they would make up examples. Oh, okay, somebody who kills his parents, could that person become a Buddha? Somebody who kills his teacher, just as bad, if not worse, than killing your parents. So they would come up with these hypothetical cases. This person with this terrible background, the terrible things they've done, could they also become a Buddha? And the answer in the Lotus Sutra is yes. It gives lots of examples like that, including one of the cousins of the Buddha, who had become a monk, who tries on multiple occasions to assassinate the Buddha. And even he is said to have the possibility of Buddhahood. So it presents difficult cases, complex cases, and the answer is anybody has that potential. But just saying it is not enough. So it makes it very difficult for people to accept it for others, but also for themselves. And that's a big part of what's going on in this sutra. And perhaps most important, philosophically speaking, is this last teaching about the universal Buddha. So who is the Buddha? Is the Buddha simply this historical figure who lived around the 6th century BCE? And the answer in the Lotus Sutra is no, that the Buddha has always been in the world, the Buddha will always be in the world, and there was never a time that we were without a Buddha. Now, this doesn't mean the historical Buddha, but because there is universal Buddhahood and universal potential for beings to become Buddhas, that means that the Buddha nature itself is always accessible in the world. And that was a huge change, particularly from Theravada Buddhism, that put all of its emphasis on the historical Buddha. So that's when we start talking about the historical Buddha as Shakyamuni Buddha, to distinguish him from other Buddhas that were either before his historical time or afterwards. Even a Buddha of the future that becomes talked about. So one of the distinguishing characteristics of Mahayana is that there are multiple Buddhas that are recognized, whereas in Theravadan, they basically recognize just the historical Buddha. So any questions about those three teachings? So this is part, as we said, of the Mahayana expansion of the Buddhist canon. So around 255 CE, we have the earliest known Chinese translation of the Lotus Sutra. There's perhaps the most famous translation, dates from 406, translated from Sanskrit into Chinese. We don't know what language the original text was written in. Usually people assume, well, it must have been written in Sanskrit because most Mahayana texts were written in Sanskrit and therefore were passed on when missionaries went to other countries like China. But there is a theory that maybe it was written in Sogdian. Sogdiana was a Central Asian kingdom and was Buddhist for quite a long time. It's located in what today we refer to as Uzbekistan. So in the present time, we don't think about Central Asia as Buddhist territory, but it had been very much Buddhist because of the Silk Road. Buddhism traveled across the Silk Road just as many products traveled back and forth. So this chapter, second chapter, expedient means, the Sanskrit word is upaya. Expedient means, skillful means. This is a certain method of teaching that is found even in the historical Buddha. It's taking the message and adapting it to the audience. Presenting the message, not changing the message, but just presenting it in the best way to have it accessible to whoever it is that you're talking to. So we looked at the example of the woman who had lost her child. The Buddha doesn't try to give her a lecture on impermanence, but he sets her a task to find mustard seeds from a home where no one has died. And so he is using upaya, he's using expedient or skillful means for her to come to the realization of impermanence of human life. So that is a very challenging way to teach, because there are no dogmas, there are no doctrines that you can hang on to. You have to adapt the teaching, be true to the teaching, but adapt it to the understanding and the background of the person that you're interacting with. So this requires both wisdom and compassion. So the Buddha knew what he was talking about when he set the task for the woman who had lost her child, but he did it in a way that was compassionate, because he doesn't want to tell her, stupid woman, you know, everybody dies, so, you know, don't bother me with all this. He has to think about her both as an intellectual being and as an emotional being. So this is the key chapter of section 1. So the 28 chapters are divided into 3 sections. There's about the first half are about wisdom, and this chapter is the most important in that section. The next is about compassion. So wisdom comes first, and compassion is developed from wisdom. Usually we think of compassion as being easier. We'll talk more about that when we get to the Heart Sutra. And then there's a single chapter, the last chapter, which is about practice. Because there's not much you can say about practice, you just have to do it. So in this chapter, the Buddha interacts with his wisest disciple by the name of Shariputra. So each of the disciples of the 10 in his inner circle was designated with certain, let's say, specialties. And so his specialty was wisdom. And what it does is reveal Buddha's wise upayic teaching strategy. So he's not only going to use upaya, he's going to explain upaya to his audience. He says, this is why I teach the way I do. So the audience itself is really quite interesting, very different than what we saw in the suttas. They give us a rundown of exactly who's there. There are 12,000 arhats, that is, practitioners at the highest level before becoming a Buddha, at least in terms of what we saw in Theravada Buddhism. 2,000 practitioners, 6,000 nuns. They're led by Mahaprajnapati. She is the stepmother and also the aunt of the Buddha, and 80,000 bodhisattvas. But there are also other beings there, not just human beings. 20,000 sons of gods led by the god Indra, 10,000 sons of gods led by the heavenly kings, 30,000 sons of gods led by freedom and great freedom. They have terrific names, and they're, again, not accidental. 12,000 sons of gods led by Brahma light bright, and 8 dragon kings. And then for each of these mythological beings, the Kimnara kings, who are known as heavenly singers and dancers, the Gandhara kings, who are heavenly musicians, the Asura kings, who are the contentious demons, the Garuda kings, who are dragon-eating birds, and then 4 kinds of human believers. What about that list? When I read this sort of thing at the beginning in the Lotus, I said, what am I doing with this book? What is this all about? Kings and dragon-eating birds, what does that got to do with philosophy? What could be the underlying message that's being sent by giving us that list? Especially since human beings are put at the very bottom of the list. Who is the Buddha teaching? Who is his audience?
Everybody.
Everybody. Yeah, he invites beings from different worlds, from different levels of existence. So even though these gods have nothing to do with Buddhism itself, these are pre-Buddhist gods. Indra is part of the Vedic canon. And yet they too are there to listen to the message of the Buddha. So that wisdom embracing all species of beings. So in terms of the triple loop learning, we can see what this strategy is. So there's the suspending, the redirecting, and the letting go. The audience, as we said, they're devotees of the Buddha, so they're not new to Buddhism. They know quite a bit about it. Many of them are highly skilled practitioners, but they are fixated on the three vehicles. So these three vehicles are skillful means. They're just helpful ways to start your practice of Buddhism. But now they're getting stuck on it. It's as if somebody had been given a drug to help them with their disease, and when they are cured, they become addicted to the drug. So they need to stop that fixation and shift. They have to change how they think about Buddha wisdom in relation to themselves. And Buddha is going to open the door of Buddha wisdom and show the Buddha wisdom to living beings. He actually describes the four-step process that he and all other Buddhas engage in when they teach, opening the door to Buddha wisdom and showing it to living beings. So this is really your true identity, this Buddha wisdom. Then redirect them. Redirect them from these upaic doctrines that are inadequate to convey reality. So there's much more to Buddhism than just the skillful means. So you have to change how we talk about Buddhist practice. And so the third thing that the teaching of the Buddha does is cause living beings to awaken to the Buddha wisdom, not just show them by opening the door, but awaken them to Buddha wisdom. They have to get in touch with that Buddha wisdom. And finally, letting go. There is a workable option besides the three vehicles that you've been following, and that is the Buddha vehicle. And therefore, we have to change how we live. And so the final thing that the Buddha teaches is inducing living beings to enter the path. So don't just recognize, oh yeah, there's Buddha wisdom out there. That's what it looks like. I want to be aware of it, but living Buddha wisdom. So that's part of this universal Buddhahood teaching, that everyone has that capacity. It's not just watching others who have Buddha wisdom, but realizing that you have that same potential yourself. So any questions about that? So in the first chapter, Shakyamuni is practicing meditation. He's in samadhi. And the members of the audience are talking to each other while he's completing his meditation. Chapter 2, he emerges from samadhi and he opens with a big moment of cognitive dissonance. He wants to begin to shake up the way they think about their practice. He questions the ability of others to understand the wisdom of the Buddhas, which is infinitely profound and immeasurable. The door to this wisdom is difficult to understand and difficult to enter. So if that's what you hear about Buddha wisdom at the very beginning, what do you think about your prospect of understanding Buddha wisdom? Buddha wisdom is the wisdom of the Buddhas. It is difficult to understand and difficult to enter. How would you rate your level of confidence with regard to Buddha wisdom?
I feel like every time I learn something new, I just look up a never-ending staircase of like, oh, there's more things I could learn.
That's a great image to use. Yes, it sounds overwhelming. And it can even be interpreted by some people to assume that Buddha is trying to tell them, you guys, you're never going to do it. You know, you might as well give up right now. But that's not at all what he's saying. He's telling them it's difficult, and yet he goes on to indicate, but you can do it. So who can understand or enter this door to Buddha wisdom? So he's diagnosing the problem. The problem is really a failure of confidence within the minds of his own followers. So he starts with parables, little stories. People love stories, no matter how old you are, what your background is, what your level of education. People just love stories. So intellectual understanding has to be supplemented by something that any human being can relate to. So even the woman who has lost her child, the story is, has anyone ever lived in a home where no one has died? So she's got to go out and she's got to figure that one out. So he goes through the list of these three vehicles. The voice hearers, Pratikya Buddhas, those two groups, voice hearers are the ones who listen to the voice of the Buddha. These are his closest followers who stay with him in the Sangha, attend all his lectures, make mental notes. They're not writing it down, but they're trying to memorize what he has said. Pratikya Buddhas are individuals, I like to put them under the stereotype of the lone wolf. They go out and practice on their own, similar to the way the Buddha started his own practice as a Buddha. So those kinds of practices, he says, that's not going to get you Buddha wisdom. It's inaccessible to people who follow that path. Now, it sounds like he's saying that you guys, you can't do it. But what he's saying is that form of practice is not going to get you to Buddha wisdom. And then this next statement is extremely important. The true entity of all phenomena can only be understood and shared between Buddhas. So only Buddhas can understand Buddhas. So what he's really saying is all of you are potentially Buddhas. He's not wasting his time talking to them, but they just can't conceive of themselves in the role of a Buddha. And therefore, they are downgrading their own capacity. And so he has to start with that. Who do you think you are? Do you really think that you can be a Buddha? He knows that they can do that, but they haven't gotten to that stage yet. So he specifically does not mention the bodhisattvas. That's the group of people who decide to postpone their awakening so that they can save others. So these come across as some kind of savior figure, even though that ultimately is a mistaken notion, as we'll see in the Diamond Sutra. So he talks about the skill set of a Buddha. What does it take to be a Buddha? Well, you have to have immeasurable mercy, unlimited eloquence, a sense of power, fearlessness, concentration, and emancipation, or be liberated, and liberated particularly from things like the dharmas. So again, it makes it sound really, really difficult. How can anyone assume that they have not just mercy, but in an immeasurable way, not just eloquence, but in an unlimited way, and have no fear and have the ability to concentrate? So there is an enlightened pedagogy or form of teaching here. The thus come one, the Tathagata, so that's not just the historical Buddha, knows how to make various kinds of distinctions and expound the teachings skillfully. His words are soft and gentle and can delight the hearts of the assembly. So even though he has this insight, even though he has come to this realization, it's not just giving them the words. He's got to have the right kind of presentation. So that's why he says, I use these different skillful teaching methods. Soft, gentle, words that delight the hearts of the assembly. You got to get their attention first. You got to bring in the audience. So the law, dharma, not my favorite translation, but the dharma, I see it more as a message. The dharma cannot be described. Words fall silent before it. So this, I think, is extremely important in terms of the role of language in Buddhism. So this goes back to what we were talking about in terms of the Dharma versus Dharmas. We try to talk about and describe the Dharmas, the framework of reality as we experience it. But the ultimate experience of reality cannot be described. Words fall silent before it. So he's going to give them words, but he's also warning them there's more to it than the words. Don't make this Dharma into one of the Dharmas, as we were talking about. And then the question that pops up, why are there 28 chapters of the Lotus Sutra if words fall silent? because that's what human beings need. Human beings are dependent on language. So you have to have this skillful way of presenting the language. But he's exposing it all. Yeah, I'm going to tell you these things, but I want you to realize there's more to it than just the words. Everybody see what his strategy is here. So he's going to start talking about the limitations of the three vehicles. Vehicles are yana, literally means something that conveys you. So the Dharma is compared to a vehicle that takes you from the samsara side of the river to the nirvana side of the river. But as that imagery also describes, when you get to the nirvana side, you don't need the vehicle anymore. You can leave the raft behind. You don't need to carry it on with you. So the teaching itself is only a means to an end. And then to make it seem like people have choices, three main approaches to Buddhist practice were represented by three different types of practitioners: the voice hearers, Pratyeka Buddhas, and the Bodhisattvas. But here in the Lotus Sutra, he basically is telling them they're all dead ends. They're not going to get you where you want to go. So what we have here is the metacognition of practitioners. This is actually a way that that scientists describe how we develop our sense of competence and our consciousness about our competence. So we start out as unconsciously incompetent. We don't even know what we don't know. So the voice hearers, because they spend all their time listening to the Buddha, they think, oh, I got this. You know, I've listened to all the talks that the Buddha gives. I memorized a lot of it, so I'm really on top of this. But they don't even know how useless just having the words in your head are. Just being able to repeat the words doesn't mean that you're competent. Now, the Pratyeka Buddhas, the ones who do their independent practice, they're consciously incompetent. They know they don't know. So they're going to go out there and they're going to practice meditation on their own. So they don't want to get dependent on the Buddha. So that's a good sign. And then there's the consciously competent, the Bodhisattvas. They know they know. So the job of the Bodhisattvas is basically to go out there into the community and give Dharma talks. So they're teaching the way the Buddha teaches. So they're competent. You know, they have studied with the Buddha. They've listened to his words. They've done their practice, and they're going to share it. And it might seem like that's the final stage, but in fact, there's one more. And that's the unconsciously competent. Beyond thinking. You're not even conscious of your competence. You just naturally do it. And that's what a Buddha would be. The Buddha doesn't even have to try to convince anyone that they're competent because it's just so obvious. So as we move from 1 through 3, we're getting higher level practitioners, but there's something beyond just going out there and talking. And that fits in with what the Buddha warned us about, that you can't really put it into words. So he comments on each of the different groups, starting with the voice hearers. So even if the whole world were filled with men like Shariputra, the wisest of the disciples, though they exhausted their thoughts and pooled their capacities, they could not fathom the Buddha's knowledge. Now, if you're Shariputra, he's standing right there, what do you think based on this comment? Does this sound good? Does it make you feel confident?
It makes it seem like he doesn't know as much as he knows.
Yeah, they can't fathom the Buddha's knowledge. So we'll have to leave it there, and we'll pick it up next time. And so he's going to go through each of these 3 vehicles and make it look like they've been wasting their time, but actually they weren't ready for the real practice, which is the Buddha vehicle, but now they are. but he has to first wean them off of these, what they think are easier paths of practice. And that's what we'll see next time. Any questions about this? So everybody has access to the chapter. If you have any problems, you let me know. Okay, so next time I think we'll be able to wrap up this chapter with, but if obviously we can't cover everything in the PowerPoint. If there are particular sections in the chapter you have questions about, just bring them in and we'll address those. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to stay a little bit and turn off the recording. Recording stopped.